A few weeks ago, there was a bit of a dust-up between two English-speaking YouTubers who both live in and make content about Japan. Alyssa, the American YouTuber who runs the channel Oriental Pearl, posted a walk-and-talk video where she highlighted things like graffiti, trash piling up, and homeless encampments, and she argued that things were generally getting worse over there. Chris, the British YouTuber who runs the channel Abroad in Japan, criticized her video as an example of cheap sensationalism, making things seem worse and more widespread than they actually are. There was a bit of a back and forth between the two, then some React channels smelled blood, which set the whole drama machinery in motion, and it pretty much always ends the same once that happens. But I'm not here for the drama. This channel's about language. What caught my attention in this online spat is that in one of her response videos, Alyssa called Chris a Kantian.
Before I go to bed, I want to say, Chris, you're being a Stop that. Stop.
To me, that sounded a bit strange. First off, based on her accent, she comes from a similar linguistic background as I do. American English, definitely Midwestern, and probably in the North, Great Lakes, thereabouts. And for me, Kantian is a gendered insult that is levied exclusively against women. It wouldn't occur to me to use it against a man. To be honest, it wouldn't occur to me to use it at all, but you know what I mean. In other varieties of English, like British English, Kantian is a non-gendered insult that you can use against anyone, really. For example, in 2015 in the United Kingdom, then Defense Minister Anna Soubry called the leader of the opposition, Ed Miliband, a sanctimonious Kantian. It made the news because of just how strong an insult it was, but the fact that it was a man being called a Kantian was unremarkable in British usage. But when it makes the news in the US, as far as I can tell, it's always a woman who's targeted. For example, in the 1990s, the late Senator John McCain got into hot water for calling his wife a Kantian in front of journalists. Or in 2018, comedian Samantha Bee called Ivanka Trump a feckless Kantian, which caused a bit of a stir. So I was a bit surprised that Alyssa would call Chris a Kantian. I went digging around a bit just to be sure that I wasn't hallucinating what the common usage was in American English. The online version of the Merriam-Webster only mentions the misogynistic insult, not the non-gendered one used in the UK and elsewhere. But to my surprise, the American Heritage Dictionary does include that definition. If they have it, then presumably some people in the US are using it that way. Digging a little further, I found that there seems to be some pockets, especially on the northeastern seaboard, where it apparently can be used that way, predominantly between men. The northeastern seaboard isn't where Alyssa is from, so there's still a disconnect there. Another reason why Alyssa's use of the term surprised me is that it just didn't really make sense to me in that context. She said it right in the middle of a section where she was inviting Chris to talk and try to resolve their differences. Like, we can work this out, let's try to be friends, and then call him what has to be one of the strongest insults in the entire English language. So what's going on there? There's a bunch of possible explanations. Some are more charitable, like, while unlikely, perhaps she did grow up in an environment where the word was used that way, and she used it basically in the same way I would use jerk. And some explanations are less charitable, like, maybe it was a calculated choice. She said it for the shock value, and the invitation to resolve their differences was never really meant in earnest. But to be honest, I'm just going to use their fight as a jumping off point to talk about an idea I find interesting. So don't take this as the definitive explanation of what happened, especially if for whatever reason you feel invested in their fight and want to score points for one side or the other. This is just one possibility among many others. So here it is. I think that when she called him a Kantian, she was actually speaking a foreign language. Well, sort of. Bear with me. A common finding among people learning a foreign language is that it's really hard to get swear words right. We tend to either overestimate or underestimate just how offensive swear words actually are in the language we're learning. If we underestimate just how offensive they are, we might end up causing a lot more offense than we intended. To use Jean-Marc Devall's analogy, some swear words are like a blunt kitchen knife, but others, like Kantian, are more like a deadly samurai sword. Because it's hard to get those swear words just right, sometimes you use the samurai sword when you meant to use the kitchen knife. You just wanted to cut a slice of cake, but instead, you ended up hacking through the entire table. If I'm right, in Alyssa's native variety of English, Kantian is exclusively a misogynistic insult. The way she used it here comes from other varieties of English, like British or Australian English. Obviously, there's a huge amount of overlap between all these varieties of English, but nonetheless, to Alyssa, these would still be in some sense foreign languages. That could make sense of that disconnect between using the word Kantian while trying to invite someone to talk things out amicably. To her, it was a foreign swear word, and she underestimated just how offensive it was. With Kantian, it probably doesn't help that when you're an American and you ask someone from the UK, Australia, or New Zealand, they might somewhat overstate just how inoffensive it supposedly is to them. They'll tell you all about the acceptable ways they can use it with friends, ways that strip the word from its more offensive power. And sometimes they'll poke a little fun at our expense, something about how Americans are oh so puritanical and they get offended by everything and anything. Which is fair enough, but if you ask them to think of a scenario where using that word might get them punched in the face, it won't take them long to think one up. Because the truth is, even if they do use it playfully among friends, Kantian is still a deadly samurai sword, even in those varieties of English. All the social and linguistic rules that determine when it's a blunt kitchen knife and when it's a deadly samurai sword, those are really complicated for us outsiders. When you learn something in a language, usually it takes on a U shape. It basically goes good, worse, better. At the beginning, you might learn how to use something correctly for a specific context, but then you try to generalize it and use it in a bunch of other contexts. That's where you start to make mistakes. What was correct in the original context may not be correct in others. Gradually, you fine-tune your understanding of how it works, and you get better at using it in a variety of different contexts. The underlying process is sometimes called cognitive restructuring. You have a mental representation of how something works, and you tweak that representation the more you learn about it. It's just speculation, but we could imagine that Alyssa is somewhere in the middle of the U-shape on this one. She learned that in British usage, the term isn't a gendered insult like it is in her native variety of English. She also learned that in certain contexts, it can be used in a way that isn't really insulting, more like playful. But she hasn't yet learned all the complex social and linguistic rules that dictate when and how it can be used in that playful way, and when and how it's just a really strong insult. But if that's what was going on, the question then becomes, but why did she use a, quote, foreign insult rather than something that would come more naturally to her, something that is part of her core native vocabulary? There's nothing particularly unusual about adapting the way we speak based on the people we're speaking to. We do it all the time. The way you speak at home is probably not exactly the same as the way you speak at work or at school. The way you speak with your best friend is probably not exactly the same as the way you speak with your grandmother. In the 1970s, social psychologist Howard Giles developed a framework to try and explain why and when we change the way we talk to adapt to others. It's called Communication Accommodation Theory, or CAT for short. One of the main ideas in CAT is that, since we're social animals, there's always a bit of push and pull in the way we interact with others. If we want to get closer to the person we're talking to, we might try and start talking like them. We make our way of speaking converge with their own. Conversely, if we want to distance ourselves from them, we might try and accentuate the differences between how we talk and how they talk. We make our way of speaking diverge from theirs. Which one we choose, divergence or convergence, depends on a wide variety of factors. It ranges from individual factors all the way up to broader social and cultural factors. An individual factor could be something like your own psychological makeup. For example, there's some evidence suggesting that if you need a lot of social validation, you'll be more likely to adapt your speech to others than people who don't feel that need for social validation all that much. A broader cultural factor could be something like asymmetries in power or prestige. For example, there's some evidence suggesting that if you speak a less prestigious variety of a language, you'll be more likely to adapt your speech than people who speak a more prestigious variety of a language. Like, If someone who speaks standard American English is talking with someone who speaks Southern American English, it's more likely that the person who speaks Southern is going to adapt to the person who speaks standard than the other way around. Here's the thing though, even when you try to accommodate the other speaker to try and get closer to him, things can go wrong and your intent might get misinterpreted. For example, imagine the person who speaks standard American English starts mimicking some features of Southern American English. They're not doing it consciously, it just happens naturally as they try to accommodate the person they're talking to. Depending on the context, it just might come off as mockery. They wanted to get closer to the person they were talking to, but they ended up mocking them without realizing it. Or imagine this scenario. You put a lot of time and effort into learning a foreign language. One day, you finally get to travel to where that language is spoken. You go to a restaurant, you order in the language, and the waiter replies in English. There are many reasons why that might happen, but one of them is that the waiter is trying to accommodate you. They're trying to make your life easier. But for you, it might be a disheartening experience. It might feel like they're rejecting you, denying all the effort you put in to try and learn that language. Both sides have the best of intentions, but the end result is that the foreign learner feels rejected. Again, this is obviously just speculation, but if we apply those concepts from CAT to Alyssa calling Chris a Kantian, we could make a case that she chose that word rather than something more familiar to her because she was trying to accommodate her interlocutor. And it doesn't have to be specifically about Chris. She's lived abroad for a long time, and the linguistic environment she's in when she speaks English is probably more diverse than what she had back in the US. There are probably more non-native speakers, and more speakers from Australian, British, or New Zealand English around her, all of whom might use the term in a way that we wouldn't in American English. Alyssa might have adapted her way of speaking accordingly. It wouldn't be an entirely foreign language, more like half foreign. I guess you could say American English is her L1, and what she learned to speak in this international environment is her L1B, or something like that. And the idea would be that when she's speaking with an American, she speaks her L1, but when she's speaking with someone who isn't American, no matter where they're from, then she naturally slips into this L1B. Or to put it in another way, if this exact same beef had gone down not with a British YouTuber like Chris, but with an American YouTuber like, say, Dogan, my guess is that she would have said something like, "You're being a jerk," rather than "You're being a Kantian." But because Chris is British, Alyssa slipped into her L1B mode and tried to accommodate him. But she used the word wrong and it backfired. She thought she was slicing a piece of cake, but she hacked right through the table. That could explain why she used it in the non-gendered sense, which isn't common in American English, and it could explain the disconnect between just how strong an insult it was and her stated desire to keep an open channel of discussion with Chris. Neither here nor there, but it also has the added benefit of being charitable. Nobody comes off looking all that bad if that's the reason it happened. Again, I don't know if that's what actually happened, but at the very least, it can serve as a reminder that this kind of thing can happen, that people aren't always successful at expressing their intent. So it doesn't hurt to be a little charitable and allow for the possibility of mistakes like that, especially in a cross-cultural context. All of that being said, when in doubt, it's probably good advice to not call strangers Kantians.